Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story: The worst family photo. It was the best vacation our family ever took, if you forget about the dead girl floating in the river. She's hard to forget, even after all these years. Wrapped in her puffy pink raincoat, bobbing gently up and down with the light ripples of the water. She appeared from a distance to be no older than 12. In truth, she was 16. Is there much of a difference? The bridge stretched over a river of middling size, and was probably less than 80 feet high. We hadn't planned to stop and take pictures there. We were in danger of being late to the ball game, Caleb's first. We told the kids that we parked our car across the bridge, over a mile from the stadium, so that we could eat at a semi-famous burger joint in the area. In reality, we did it so we wouldn't have to pay the outrageous stadium parking fee. Regardless, with full bellies we had just begun our walk to the park, and were totally content. Earlier in the day, when the clouds had been threatening and the air was heavy with that pre-downpour restlessness, I'd feared a rain out. Caleb would have been crushed. But the clouds had amounted to nothing more than a light drizzle. And now, the sun was beginning to poke through in places. It was a good thing, too. The damn ball game had been the whole reason to take a vacation in the first place. I suppose the story really starts 2 years earlier, at Caleb's Little League tryouts. Jade and I thought it was important that our kids be involved in team sports. I, growing up, hadn't been. A fact which I often felt a bit sad about. When Caleb turned 9, we arrived at baseball not out of any great love for the game, but rather a dearth of options. Caleb was too short for basketball, and Jade wouldn't hear of her boy catching brain damage on a football field. In the weeks leading up to the tryouts, I'd had my younger brother teach Caleb the basics. How to swing a bat, throw a ball. I watched the two of them practicing in the backyard from our old kitchen window, having no clue whether or not the kid was any good. But he looked like he was having fun. And wasn't that what mattered? Anyway, I wasn't expecting him to be a superstar. I just hoped he wouldn't embarrass himself at tryouts. He didn't. In fact, when I picked him up that day, he seemed to think he had a shot at making the minor 2S. There were 3 leagues for kids his age to play in, determined by talent level: the minor 1S, the minor 2s, and the majors. We'd anticipated, of course, that in his first year he would play in the minor 1S, with a chance to move up as the years progressed. We were shocked beyond speaking the night he got the phone call from one of the league's head coaches. He'd made the majors. The coach told Caleb that he'd drafted him because even though our boy wasn't the biggest or most talented kid on the field, he played with heart and hustle and grit, just like a certain big league ballplayer. So that was how, on that overcast summer morning, we found ourselves on the bridge. I strolled along the gravelly sidewalk, fingers intertwined with Jade's. Caleb walked, skipped, almost, just ahead of us, a hat cocked on his head and the name of his childhood hero stretched across the top of his back. His little sister, Abra, strode near him, struggling with a yo-yo we'd bought her that morning. Everything was so picturesque, and the tall trees flanking the river so beautiful, that Jade stopped the family to take a photo. That was where our perfect vacation stopped being perfect. Abra whined. She hated taking pictures. The lighting's perfect right now. My dear, Jade responded patiently. And if there's one thing I hope you learn from your mother, it's that you never waste perfect lighting. She pulled the family camera from a pocket I didn't even know her jacket had, and angled it carefully on the concrete railing of the bridge, which stood less than 5 feet high. In the present day, our story might have played out much differently. But when our children were young, we owned no smartphones or even digital cameras. There were no such devices to own. This family camera used rolls of film, and Jade had stocked up on those before the vacation. She'd get them all developed at Walmart's photo center when we made it back home. Once the camera was propped up just so, Jade set the timer and hurried over to take her place next to me in the family lineup. The picture snapped. Jade ran back to set the timer again, in case someone had blinked, of course, and rushed back once more to her family. Artificially wide smiles stamped on each face. The camera snapped a second time. Moments later, a strange sound floated through the air, a cross between a splash and a dull thud. Nobody thought much of it. The sound wasn't even that noticeable above the flow of the river, until a woman's desperate wail rang out behind us. We all whirled around at once, some 100 yards away, partially concealed by the light rise and fall of the bridge's middle. A woman was clawing her fingernails into her face. She stared, horror-struck, over the edge of the bridge, a sobbing shriek on her lips, her expression utterly grotesque. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I wanted my children far away from the situation. I gave the tickets to my wife, keeping one for myself, and told her I would meet the 3 of them at the stadium. For now, I said, I'll see if this woman needs help. We set off on our separate paths. But then 2 jigsaw pieces came together in my mind. Jade? I said. My wife turned. Don't let the kids look down there. As far as I know, the kids didn't look down there. It's a good thing, too. The sight has never left me. When I approached the hysterical woman on the bridge, an important-looking man in a smart business suit had already reached her from the other side. He was peering over the chest-high barrier, all that stood between passers-by and a deadly fall. Said the man, a bit more matter-of-factly than the situation called for. Dreadful. If the woman was bothered by his aloofness, or if she even noticed it, she didn't let on. She was now sitting on the pavement, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, rocking back and forth and sobbing and repeating the word, Natalie, over and over. Blood speckled her cheeks from where she had scratched herself. The man pulled from beneath his suitcoat pocket a cellular phone which, impressive though it was at the time, would have been considered comically huge just 5 years later. He pressed 3 digits on it and began to speak to the emergency operator, his voice carrying over the sobs of the woman near my feet. I remember thinking, with some righteousness, that I just couldn't see the appeal in a cellular phone. Imagine people being able to get a hold of you whenever they wanted. I closed my eyes, knowing full well what I'd see. I opened them seconds later, and allowed myself to glance over the ledge. Sure enough, a young girl lay dead below, bobbing lightly up and down with the movement of the water. She lay in a pocket of water surrounded by tall plants, which was reasonably still and quite shallow. This pocket seemed to be the only reason she hadn't been swept downstream. What's more, it may well have been the reason she died. Had she landed in deeper, moving water, she might have survived the fall. She looked, as I said when the story began, no older than 12. She wore a puffy pink raincoat that seemed to be too small and juvenile for her, as though it was bought for a girl much younger than she, because despite appearances, the girl below me, whose name was presumably Natalie, was actually a junior in high school. Or at least, she had been. The girl's blonde hair spread out like a fan from her head, and a ray of sunlight escaped the clouds above, giving her a vaguely angelic look. Or perhaps that was my imagination. Regardless, as I stood there, unable to look away, listening without hearing to the man next to me as he spoke his final words to the emergency operator, I realized something. Young Natalie had the misfortune of being the first dead body I'd ever seen in my life. Neither I nor the cell phone-bearing businessman made an effort to console the woman near us or even approach her in conversation. She was now lying in the fetal position and trembling slightly, an occasional whimper sliding between her lips. The spots of blood from her cheeks were now smeared across her face, making the whole sorry scene look more criminal than it should have. We both hovered nearby, knowing the police would wish to speak with us, feeling like intruders on this woman's grief. A few minutes later, the woman was no longer crying. It seemed like she'd cried herself out. In fact, but her whimpers had turned to wails, and she clutched and pulled at the fabric of her blouse so hard I thought it might rip. I had a flashback of my childhood, reading Bible stories with my parents, stories about men like Job and David who were so overcome with grief that they rent their own garments into pieces. Such an extravagant display of anguish seemed a little unrealistic to me at the time. But in the presence of this woman, it was those passages which came to mind. After what seemed an eternity, a single police officer arrived. This seemed negligent to me. Granted, I came from a much smaller city, with a much less busy police force. But still, the image of the girl named Natalie floating below seemed disturbing enough to warrant at least a second lawman. The young officer, who was clearly overwhelmed by the situation, had the bad sense to begin speaking with all three of us at the same time. The man in the suit introduced himself as an employee of what I gathered was a rather impressive firm downtown, and he did so with such aplomb that the police officer seemed to think this man, and not he, was in charge. I was standing over there, near the main road, the man said, pointing from whence he had come. When I heard a scream, this woman's scream. He nodded to the woman, now on her hands and knees, moaning lowly and seemingly unaware of her surroundings. She was staring over the edge of the bridge. I looked over myself as I hurried toward her, and saw the young girl's body lying below. Good, said the police officer. He seemed deeply distracted by the almost inhuman noises coming from the woman at our feet, emanating from her at random intervals. He turned to me. And you? I told him my story. Then the officer crouched down, and with more authority and grace than he had heretofore demonstrated, began to address the woman. Ma'am, my name is Officer Morris. I'm here to help you. Do you think you could answer just a couple questions for me? Slowly, the woman looked up at him and nodded. The blood on her face had crusted and her expression was grotesque. I began to wonder what my face would look like if my entire life had been flipped upside down in a mere moment. "Who is the girl, ma'am?" The woman hiccuped loudly. "She's my daughter, Natalie. She's 16. And could you tell me what happened, ma'am, in your own words?" My mind, as minds are wont to do, latched onto a wholly unimportant detail. The phrase, "in your own words," used purely out of ceremony, as if the woman could have spoken someone else's words, and almost forgot to listen to the far more interesting things being said. I could. The woman took a deep breath, and then told her story with no sobs, no hiccups, no interruptions to speak of. Natalie was very, very sick. The doctors weren't totally sure what was wrong with her. They thought it was a bad bout of food poisoning at first. But it just wouldn't go away. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. She could hardly keep any food down. And she was constantly achy and nauseous and pale. I took her out of school for most of April and May. Anyway, that's the whole reason we were out here. She was feeling a little better today. Or so she told me. When the rain stopped, and the sun started to shine through the clouds, she begged me to let her go outside. It was her favorite kind of weather. So she and I got dressed and went out here for a walk. We were planning on going to one of the parks down by the frontage road. And that's how. The woman took a deep breath. She sounded as though something large were caught in her throat. And that's how we ended up here. On the bridge, she said. We were walking together, side by side. She fell behind. Just a few steps. I didn't notice. I don't think she wanted me to notice. The next thing I knew, she was over the edge. She jumped. Officer Morris nodded. You saw her jump? No, thank God. I heard her land down there, in the river. I turned around to look over the edge. And that's when I saw her. The woman's voice wavered, and tears filled her eyes once more. And before hardly a moment had passed, she was a puddle of hysterics again. Officer Morris looked resigned. There would be no more answers from her. At least, not for a while. He turned to us. Gentlemen, write your contact information down on this paper, and then you can go. I did. As I handed the paper back to Officer Morris, he said, enjoy the game. I did. It's amazing what a person can put out of their mind, if they need to. I had just witnessed the most disturbing scene of my life, and not an hour later was at a baseball game with my family. The game was surprisingly wonderful. I'd always thought of baseball as boring. But actually being in the stadium, as opposed to watching on TV, was an enormous improvement. What's more, Caleb's favorite player made up for his poor first at-bats with a go-ahead double in the 8th inning, when he slid into second base headfirst, a pure demonstration of the hustle he was known for. I thought Caleb might actually faint with joy. Like I said, it was the best vacation our family ever took. If you can forget about Natalie. And for a few weeks, nobody had much problem forgetting about Natalie. Nobody but me had seen the body. Caleb and Abra didn't even know there had been a body. As far as we knew, they didn't know anything had happened at all. I suppose that's why it was such a shock. One night a few weeks after the vacation, when Abra knocked on our bedroom door and said, Mom, Dad, Natalie says you should look closer. We glanced at each other, not connecting the dots at first. Jade walked over to open the bedroom door. What? "Sweetie?" she said, crouching down to meet our daughter's gaze. At the picture, Abra said, "Natalie wanted me to tell you to look closer at it." What Abra didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that earlier in the day, Jade had the pictures from our vacation developed. I had come home from work for a long lunch, and Jade and I spent the hour flipping through the pictures together, laughing and reminiscing. It was great fun, until we got to the pictures on the bridge. There were only 2 of them, the first take, and the second. In the first, our family was standing together on the bridge, smiling brightly. In the second, taken in case any of us had blinked or made a face in the first, nobody had. Our family stood and smiled just the same as before. Only one detail was different, in the background of the second picture. On the farthest edge of the photograph, a blonde-haired girl in a puffy pink raincoat could be seen in mid-flight. Falling from the bridge, I saw Natalie first, feeling me tense up, perhaps hearing my light intake of breath. Jade turned to me. "What's wrong, hun?" she asked. Awestruck, I found myself unable to speak, to articulate. I simply pointed at the picture. Jade looked down. "What are you?" Oh my God. Oh my God." A small scream escaped her lips. She's... Jade turned her face away. No, I can't look at it. Throw it away." I didn't need to be told twice. I snatched up the photograph, strode to our kitchen, opened the cupboard below the sink and threw it in the garbage can. "No, Jade began. "Not there. I need it out of the house. It's vile." She shuddered. At first I wasn't sure why she had reacted so strongly. But then I realized, Jade hadn't really experienced much of anything that day on the bridge. She hadn't spent half an hour with a grief-addled mother. She hadn't seen Natalie's corpse bobbing in the water, hair floating outward like an ornate crown. She had largely escaped the situation, and I had only given her the barest details. She'd never asked for more. Jade sat on the couch, legs curled up to her chest, looking thoroughly disturbed. I knew, at that moment, that she was picturing her own children launching themselves headfirst over the bridge. The kitchen garbage can was good enough for me. But if Jade wanted it out of the house, then out of the house it would go. "All right," I said, picking the photo back out of the garbage can and taking it out the garage door. I walked around to the side of our house, where the big outdoor garbage buckets were. I took out the top garbage bag, threw the picture in, and put the bag down on top of it. Before I did, though, I snuck one last quick look at the young girl, her arms outstretched, her hair billowing around her, the sun glimmering off it as she fell to her early death. Jade had been right. The lighting was perfect. Jade turned her gaze from Abra and looked at me, furious. "I thought I told you to get it out of the house," she said. I did," I said, nonplussed. "I buried it deep in the outside can." "Not deep enough, apparently," she said. "Don't fight," said Abra. I didn't look at it. "I don't want to." Jade and I looked back at our daughter. "I just want you to look at it." "Well, Natalie does. She says you didn't look close enough." We were silent for a few moments. Then I managed. "What do you mean?" "Natalie says?" Abra rolled her eyes. She was at that age, giving attitude to her parents constantly, but still too young for it to be anything other than cute. "I mean," she said, inflecting her words as though she were the one speaking to a 6-year-old. Natalie says, "I don't know why. It's just what she said." "WW, what are you talking about?" Jade stammered. "Who's Natalie? Sweetie? When did she say this to you?" "Just now," Abra said. Then, sensing we needed more explanation, added, "She's in my bedroom." I'd never moved so fast in my life. In 2 strides I was past my wife and daughter, in 2 more. Halfway to Abra's bedroom, not even pausing to think about what I'd find. I flung open her door and stepped inside. Nothing. There was nobody there. Of course there's nobody here. I thought, what the hell are you thinking? Jade and Abra were right behind me. This time, it was Abra's turn to look nonplussed. "Natalie?" Abra called. "Natalie?" She sighed angrily. "God, she was here a minute ago." "Don't say, God," Jade said feebly. I think she was desperate for some sense of normalcy to invade the conversation. "Some people don't like it." "You say it," Abra accused. "I know, sweetie. Grown-ups." I interrupted. "Abra, where did Natalie come from? What did she look like?" "I don't know. She looked normal," Abra said, shrugging. "She just knocked on the door and I let her in." "The door to the house?" "No, the door to my room. I don't open the door to the house. You told me not to. Remember?" "Yes. Of course we remember," I said, glancing back nervously at her bedroom door. "That's good, sweetie. Good for you. But when you say she looked normal, like, how old was she? What color was her hair?" "Yellow," Abra said promptly. "I don't know how old she was. Older than Caleb, but younger than me and Mom?" "Yeah," she said. Then, with a bit more attitude, "Why are you guys freaking out so much?" "She was nice." Jade looked at me helplessly, terrified. "What the fuck?" she mouthed. I shrugged. I didn't know what to say to either of them. Abra broke the silence, grumbling, "Fine. Don't answer me." Then, sweetie, it's sort of complicated," Jade said. "Why?" Abra demanded. "Listen, Mom." She came in and sat right there. Abra pointed at the bed. "She was really nice to me. She said I reminded her of her little sister. She said that her sister's name was Eliza. She said that she missed Eliza. And she said that I needed to tell you to look closer at the picture." I asked her what picture, and she wouldn't tell me. She just said it was really important that I told you to look closer. She made me promise. So then I came and told you. And I don't know where she went. She glared at her mother fiercely, as though wondering what could possibly be the least bit complicated about that. "Okay, thanks, sweetie," Jade said softly. "I'll stay here with you. And I guess your daddy will go take a closer look at that picture?" I shrugged, feeling more out of my depth than I had perhaps ever felt in my life. "Sure, yeah, I guess. You don't want to come with?" "I can't look at it again," Jade said, lightly pressing our daughter's head to her bosom. "That poor woman, reaching out like that. I'll never get it out of my mind as is." "Well, what am I looking for?" Jade shrugged. I was already to the garage by the time the strangeness of her remark struck me. "Woman? Reaching out?" I opened the lid of the garbage can and pulled the top bag out. There, below it, a bit damp, was the photograph. I picked it up. It was already dark outside. but the motion sensor on the side of our house had triggered, and one of the outdoor lights turned on. Huddling under it, holding the picture near the bulb, I did as my daughter told me to, and looked closer. I saw immediately what Jade had been talking about, but it was easy to see how I'd missed it. On the far side of the shot, next to where the girl's falling body was, were the outstretched arms of Natalie's mother. Most of her body and about half of her face was covered by Caleb and his cocked-up ball cap. But she was there, behind our family, watching helplessly as her own family crumbled. Her outward gesture was desperate. I understood why Jade couldn't look at the photo again. Perhaps no mother could help replacing that billowing golden hair with the hair of her own child. Those outstretched arms with her own. God, what a thing, I thought to myself. And our family had gotten wrapped up in the middle of it. Somehow, the light went off, leaving me with only the glow of the moon to see by. I waved my arm around, and the light turned back on. My thoughts all seemed to be pounding on my skull at once, demanding to be heard, each claiming their utmost importance. Thus, I found myself unable to give full attention to any one of them. But beneath them all was the vague idea that I was missing something. How on earth had Abra even known about the picture? About the girl named Natalie? Perhaps she had looked down after all. That day on the bridge? Still, it wouldn't explain how she knew the girl's name. And there was something else, too. Something in the back of my mind. But getting closer to the front, that didn't quite add up. And Abra had seemed so totally convinced that a girl named Natalie had actually been in her room. Was I willing to seriously entertain that possibility? No, I frantically told myself. There were plenty of explanations that made sense. I didn't need to start telling myself ghost stories. But what other explanations make sense? Name one. Just one. Something's wrong. Something's wrong here. And you know it. But what was wrong? How could I know what was wrong when I couldn't even form a coherent thought? Even the most preposterous explanations didn't make sense. Suppose, after all, that Natalie's ghost really had visited my daughter. All for the purpose of, what? Getting me to take a closer look at this photograph? I turned it over in my hands, examined the front, the back. I had learned nothing new on second glance. Nothing at all, except Natalie was very, very sick. It all came in an instant. She begged me to let her go outside. It was her favorite kind of weather. My mind flashed back to that day on the bridge. She fell behind. Just a few steps. I didn't notice. I was right. Something was very wrong. The next thing I knew, she was over the edge. She jumped. And what had Officer Morris asked Natalie's mother? You saw her jump? Hands shaking, I looked once more at the photo, which now seemed more vile than I, or Jade, had ever realized. No, thank God. I heard her land down there, in the river. I turned around to look over the edge, and that's when I saw her. The difference was subtle, but obvious once noticed. The positioning of the wrists, the hands, the arms of Natalie's mother were not outstretched, as they had first seemed, in a desperate attempt to catch her child. And though only part of her face was visible, it was clear Natalie's mother did not wear a shocked expression. Not horrified, not grief-stricken. I've never seen another face quite like it, to be honest, and I doubt you have either. unless you've borne witness to a woman murdering her own daughter." Detective Nadeau closed her eyes and sighed. "We've suspected. We've looked into it. But there was no proof, none at all. And, you know, a grieving mother, it's not the kind of accusation you want to bring up unless you've actually got something." I didn't know what to say. I remained quiet, trying to stop my foot tapping on the tile floor. The door to Detective Nadeau's office was closed, but all the sounds of a bustling workplace behind us were still clearly audible. I only wish, well, not that it would have helped. "What?" I asked. Natalie had a younger sister, Eliza. I tried to look like I hadn't already known this information. The detective continued. "She died of a bad flu years before, when she was just a little girl. There was no need to feign surprise here." Abra's words rang in my head. She said that she missed Eliza. I should say, it looked like a bad flu. At least. Now, well, it seems doubtful, doesn't it? She said this more to herself than to me. We were both silent for a while longer. Then she cleared her throat, shook her head lightly, and took on the same businesslike air she'd had when I first stepped into her office. "Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention," she said. "The picture by itself doesn't prove that she threw Natalie over, of course, but you're correct. It completely contradicts her testimony. Both testimonies. In fact, she was questioned again by a detective the next day. It probably won't be enough for a conviction, but it should be enough to stop." Her voice trailed off. She cleared her throat again, then said, "Again, thank you. Do you have any questions for me?" I had a million questions, most of them revolving around the fact that it seemed for all the world like an actual ghost had visited my daughter. But I kept those to myself. I shook my head. Detective Nadeau stood up, staring at the photograph in her hand. "It's lucky you noticed this. You're right. It's not obvious on first glance. And the chances of you even taking this picture in the first place." "I know," I said. "It's crazy." I didn't bother to tell her that my wife's good timing had been just about the least crazy detail of our entire story. Crazy doesn't begin to cover it, the detective said. She looked down at the floor, as though trying to decide something, then lowered her voice and said, "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but this woman is currently trying to file for adoption." Story. Every Christmas Eve, a monster challenges me to a game. Growing up, I don't think we had a single moment free of struggle. We were a poor family that couldn't make ends meet most months, living basically day to day as we tried our best to stretch my father's income until the next paycheck came in. My father, God bless his soul, raised me by himself, and he was a hard-working man throughout his life. Mom died giving birth to me, her first and only child, and my father refused to remarry and make things easier for him. I only ever loved one woman, he told me when we talked about it once I reached adulthood. That's not something you can replace. I'll take those feelings with me to the grave. Being the sole breadwinner in the house was a tall order to have to step up to. He was barely ever home, away for various jobs even during the weekends. In a sense, I sort of raised myself now that I think about it. But his absence never made me despise my father or grow distant towards him. Quite the opposite, in fact. It made the few precious moments we got to share mean even more to me. Some of those moments were during holidays like Easter or Christmas. When he didn't work, we lived out in the boonies in a small house that he inherited when Grandpa passed away. A cramped but comfortable place that was just the right size for the two of us. It was also close to the wilderness, so my father would go out hunting for meat every once in a while. Don't question me on his methods or the legality of his actions. I can't answer either. Truth is, I never knew or cared. All that mattered was that he filled the fridge and kept me fed without having to spend a dime from our already limited budget. I grew up mostly on venison and wild rabbit. Pork and especially beef were a rarity. He tried to teach me from a young age, to impart his knowledge onto me. But I wasn't an eager learner. I had no problem with eating cute forest critters. I just couldn't hunt them and kill them myself. But my father still tried, taking me out on a few hunting trips with him and our old dog, Charles, my father's companion into the wilderness. Wasn't a pure breed, of course. Just an old mutt that my father rescued from a shelter. But he was big and had a keen sense of smell despite his age. So he was a huge help in tracking down prey. The few times I saw him in action, I was impressed. One such instance comes to mind right away. The three of us, Charles, my father, and I were out looking for a deer on a chilly autumn day. We found tracks and followed them until we spotted the deer. But my father missed the shot and scared it away. Charles ran after it when the deer bolted, and we ran after the dog to not lose him. He led us on a wild chase through the forest for a few minutes. But we finally caught up to him on the banks of a river that crisscrossed the trees. "What's he doing?" I asked my father when we saw Charles pacing back and forth on the edge of the whirling waters. "The deer probably jumped in and got swept by the current," my father answered. "The water washed away the scent trail. So Charles is confused." We followed the river downstream. And true enough, we found the deer's carcass. Charles strutted over to it victoriously, giving us a good laugh. We had venison steak for dinner that night, and my father made sure to give Charles a big, juicy cut for his troubles. Anyways, my story takes place in that home, when I was about 8 years old. Despite our shaky financial situation, my father always tried to make the holiday season special for me. He could never afford fancy gifts, like Game Boys for example when those were hot. But his gestures never went unappreciated. We mostly painted eggs together for Easter, or went out hiking before Christmas to find nice trees we could fell and bring home to decorate. But that particular Christmas hadn't gone down as planned. A few months beforehand, Dad fell ill, and his condition worsened until he was left bedridden. He didn't want to go see a doctor right away, saying that he only needed to rest. But he eventually relented. After a round of tests, the doctors told him the one thing that nobody wants to hear. He had pancreatic cancer. And it already started spreading to other organs. All cancers are nasty, ugly affairs, but the pancreatic kind is especially vile. It gives nearly no symptoms until it is too late to do something about it. And that was the case for my father. Even with treatment, the doctors said that his chances for survival were slim at best. But my father refused treatment, so they predicted his death to happen sometime around New Year's. The news devastated him, though he shielded me from them to the best of his ability. I only found out about it later, When I was older, as it stood, I only knew that he was sick. Being a young kid that thought of his father as a permanent part of their life. The thought that he might die never even occurred to me. But he deteriorated visibly each day, until a neighbor had to come over every so often to help him out with the most basic tasks. Why not someone from our family? You might ask? Simple. We had few living relatives. And the ones we did have were deadbeats, never giving a crap about us except when they needed to borrow money. They wouldn't have helped take care of a sick man, and they definitely wouldn't have taken me in after my father's passing. Listen, Nico, Dad told me one December evening after calling me into his bedroom. I'll be very sick for a while. I might never get better. His voice was weak and raspy, and I could tell that he had difficulty getting those few words out. You will, I protested. Maybe. He relented. But until that happens, you'll need to go and live with someone else that can take care of you. I don't want to, I said, stomping my foot down. I know, he admitted, a few tears forming around his eyes. But you have to do it. For me, okay? I almost cried myself, though it was more out of frustration than anything else. I didn't understand the severity of our predicament back then. Turning around, I found the neighbor in the doorway, with tears in her eyes as well. She was an older lady living all by herself some 15 minutes away. The closest person to us out here. Her name was Daisy, and she'd always been kind to me, giving me homemade sweets and pocket money whenever me and Dad went over to help her out with small chores. She'd been the closest thing I had to a grandma growing up. Miss Daisy made some arrangements. Dad said after a short pause, "Some nice people will come by after Christmas, and you'll have to go with them." Okay? I didn't stay around to listen anymore. I ran out of the room, bawling my eyes out. Daisy yelled after me, trying to stop me, but I couldn't. I didn't want to live with someone else. I wanted to stay with my dad. After I got outside, I made my way to my usual spot where I played most days. A dingy little treehouse that Dad built for me a couple of summers back. But I loved the place to death. I climbed up into it to hide, having no plans to actually run away from home. I simply wanted to be alone for a while, in a place where Daisy couldn't reach me to drag me back inside. I heard her calling for me for quite some time, but she eventually relented and went home for the night. But I spent the night wide awake up in the treehouse, looking over the forest as I tried to think of a way to solve our problems. I didn't have any money, and with Christmas right around the corner and me being a child, I couldn't earn it fast enough either. So any ideas involving doctors or payment in general were out first. I wasn't particularly religious either, so prayer never even crossed my mind. Santa, I decided after every other solution went nowhere. He always brought me what I wanted. I'll ask him to make Dad better as my Christmas present. Not a bad plan, so long as you believed in Santa, of course. Which at that young age I still did. In my mind it was foolproof. A 100% guaranteed chance of success. I'd been a good boy all year. I helped out and never misbehaved. So Santa would have to give me the present I wanted. After that plan was hatched, I went back inside and went to bed. No point in ruining my good boy streak. The next day I woke up first thing in the morning, got my dad's hand saw, and ventured out into the woods all by my lonesome. With him being bedridden, we hadn't gone hunting for a Christmas tree that year. But we needed one for Santa. Didn't we? That we did, and I decided to take the matter into my own hands. I spent all morning and a good chunk of the afternoon searching, until I found a fir that I considered good enough. Don't ask me the exact species. I have no idea. Back then they were all Christmas trees to me. Anyway, I got it down all by myself, which proved to be a much more difficult task than I had expected. I got tangled in the branches as I tried to reach its trunk. I received plenty of scratches, nearly poked out one of my eyes at some point, but I succeeded, and I dragged it back home victoriously. "Where were you?" Daisy scolded when I entered the house. She'd returned while I was away, and she was ready to give me an earful for my outburst. "Your father was worried sick for you." I let her scold me to her heart's content, apologized, and brought the tree inside. Dad was impressed with me, and he all but dragged himself out of bed to help me set up the tree. I realized in the meantime that he hoped to spend one final Christmas with me, to give me some heartwarming memories to hold on to when he'd be gone. But at that moment I didn't consider it. I simply had fun carrying out our usual Christmas routine. We didn't have much to hang on the branches. No fancy lights and candles and whatnot. Just the same old tinsel and baubles that we reused ever since I could remember. But the tree still turned out stunning. And it was made even better for me by the fact that I went out and got it myself. I behaved after that, waiting for the days to pass one by one. Dad got visibly worse with each one, to the point where he needed to be spoon-fed and couldn't get up to use the bathroom. But I still held out hope, convinced that once Christmas came, Santa would give me my present. It felt like years waiting for the 24th to arrive, but it swung around eventually. I stayed up waiting, knowing full well that I wasn't supposed to do that. After all, Santa skipped houses if the kids inside didn't sleep. But I wanted to meet him and ask him my wish face to face, to make sure that it would come true. Evening came and passed. Night settled outside, and I pretended to go to sleep after we ate dinner and Daisy left. As soon as I was sure that Dad was asleep, I got up and made my way to the living room on my toes. With no place to really hide in the small room, I got behind the Christmas tree and waited. My hope was that the darkness would hide me for long enough until Santa came in. The only clock in the house was on the opposite wall, in full view but barely visible. I watched the seconds ticking away into minutes, seeing 10 p.m. turn to 11. It was quite the ordeal to stand and wait for that long. But I was determined. I nearly fell asleep at one point, but 11:59 rolled around, and that sobered me up real good. I held my breath as I watched the sweep hand going, until it reached the last second before midnight. Then it got stuck, refusing to transition into midnight. Did the battery run out? I wondered. At any rate, I thought no big deal of it. Just because the clock stopped didn't mean that midnight wouldn't come. I waited for a few seconds, for Santa to come down the admittedly small chimney. But as the seconds turned into a minute, I started to worry. Did he figure me out? Did I undo all of my goodness with this one stunt? Did he skip our house? I got out from behind the tree, walking out in the open as my worry turned to panic. I'd blown it. No, I whispered with desperation. No, 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 no. Please, I'm sorry. Please. The words got stuck in my throat when I heard something from outside. The sound of skittering feet approaching the house from the surrounding woods. Tapping on the walls as something climbed to the roof. Santa came after all, and I waited for him with bated breath. The sounds of his rushing feet reached the roof. Then they stopped. I looked at the chimney intently, backing away slowly to give him room. Something scraped against the bricks and mortar, giving off a bristly sound. And before long I saw a face emerge from the fireplace. Two beady black eyes came into view first, scanning the room from side to side and settling on me. The rest of his head followed, looking like silly putty being forced through a tube. My wonder turned to terror as he advanced little by little, revealing a thin, centipede-like body with many small legs. After it was done, and he was fully in the room with me, he stared at me for what felt like hours. His mouth contorted into a twisted grin, the corners of his lips cracking and spreading until they reached his ears. Hundreds of tiny, needle-sharp teeth peered at me from inside his maw, yellowed and blasted with decay. "What are you doing up so late, child?" it questioned, bringing me out of my stupefaction. "You should be sleeping." I'm waiting for Santa," I stuttered and answered. Are you him?" "You shouldn't be waiting for Santa," he answered. "That makes you a naughty boy." "I'm sorry," I mumbled, on the verge of tearing up. "But I wanted." "Let me guess," he said in a bored tone. "You wanted to ask for a specific gift? What would it be? A new bicycle? Toys? Make Daddy feel better. He's sick," I said with conviction. "That's the only present I want." He raised an eyebrow hearing that, and scurried closer to me. His long body coiled, surrounding me as his beady eyes examined me. The color in my face drained, and it took all I had to keep from screaming and running away. "Very well," he answered. "Let us see your father. I might be able to offer you what you wish for." He pulled away, allowing me to lead him to Dad's bedroom. I did so, opening the door slowly to reveal the dark room. Dad was in his bed sleeping, so Santa followed me inside. He pushed himself up, holding his spindly body above Dad with only a couple of hind legs. "He does look sick," he admitted. One of his front limbs reached down, touching Dad's forehead. "Very sick, but I can help." "Then do it, please," I whispered. "I will, but only if you play a game with me," he answered. "If you beat me at it, I'll cure your father." And if I lose?" I asked, scared by the prospect. "That's a surprise you'll have to find out," he answered and gave me another grin that sent chills down my spine. I wanted to refuse, but seeing Dad in that state broke my heart. He'd done so much for me over the years that I couldn't let him down now when he needed me. "What's the game?" I asked. "You've been a good little boy all year, so I'll let you choose," he said. I thought it over for a bit, trying to decide what game I was best at. I didn't know a lot of them, so my options were limited, but I eventually settled on one. "Hide and seek," I answered. His grin grew a bit wider hearing that. "Okay," he said with satisfaction. "I'll do the seeking. You'll do the hiding. If I can't find you for 10 minutes, you win. Is that good?" "Yes," I answered, already thinking of potential hiding spots. "Great. I'll count to 100. So scurry off and hide." He turned to face the wall and started counting out loud. So I bolted out of the room and left the house entirely. As tempting as it was to hide inside, I figured it would be the first place he'd look for me. My best chance was to get as far away as possible before he started searching. The moment I got outside, I was taken aback by what I found. It was snowing pretty heavily only minutes prior, but now the bulky flakes were suspended in midair. There was no wind, no sound, no movement whatsoever, like the world itself paused for our game. It looked and felt surreal. Hearing the creature counting loudly inside, I blocked all of it out and continued running. I counted down from 100 in my head as I went. And I got pretty far away from home in that time. I hoped to make it to the treehouse, but it was too far away. So I dove into some bushes instead. Without anything on me to tell time, I had to approximate as I waited for the 10 minutes to pass. I think it was 2 minutes in by the time he left the house as well. I could see his monstrous figure leaving through the front door in the moon's pale light. But something was different. He moved faster, more erratically, his head turning from side to side in search of me. I thought he didn't know about the treehouse, but I was wrong. He scurried past the bushes I was hiding in, going right for it. I caught a glimpse of his face when he passed by, and his expression petrified me. He looked scary before, but now he looked downright terrifying. The grin on his lips more evil than I thought possible. He really wanted to catch me. I saw him reaching the treehouse, climbing up with little effort. He pushed his body inside through the window, breaking some of the planks apart in the process. When he didn't find me up there, he let out an angry screech and started tearing the treehouse to shreds. I saw pieces of it flying as he thrashed about inside, until all that was left was a devastated husk. When he was done, he climbed down and looked at the forest for a few tense moments. I started realizing just how dire my situation was, so I retreated further into the darkness. But before I did, I saw his face contorting as something bubbled to the surface of his skin between his eyes. A deformed snout formed out of his flesh, and he started sniffing the air with it. I didn't wait to see if he'd find me, knowing full well that he would. Instead, I got out of the bushes on the other side and ran away deeper into the forest. I estimated that maybe 5 minutes had passed, so I had 5 more to go. The sounds of his feet rushing after me came from behind, so I forced myself to run even faster. With hiding out of the question, I had to find a way to escape him for long enough. The way Charles tracked down prey using his sense of smell came to mind, so I knew I needed to erase my scent somehow. The river, I decided, remembering how that deer managed to escape Charles and his nose. I ran into its general direction, deeper and deeper into the woods, and I eventually came across it. Luckily for me, it wasn't entirely frozen over. I stepped out on the treacherous ice until I felt it cracking beneath my feet. So I shot a soul at it and broke it. I fell into the freezing water, feeling it pushing all of the air out of my lungs as it seeped into my clothes and invaded my skin. It was frigid, and thermal shock or hypothermia were very real dangers. But they didn't worry me much at that moment. In fact, they barely crossed my mind. My only goal was to escape the horrific creature that was after me. The current pushed me under the ice and carried me along on its underside, scraping me against the jagged edges that had formed. I got scratched and bruised, Sensation left the tips of my fingers and feet as the cold worked its way into my flesh. And my lungs burned for air. The ordeal didn't last for long, but it was excruciating. Half a minute later at most, the current spat me out of another break in the ice. I clung to it, trying in vain to drag myself out as I panted heavily. Prying my eyes open, I could barely make out the spot upstream where I jumped in. The creature reached it and paused, sniffing the air as puffs of steam left his nostrils. He looked around in confusion, so I ducked back down into the waters. Despite the heavy price I paid, my plan worked. Coming back up to the surface, I saw him crossing the river and continuing deeper into the woods. As the few minutes left of our game passed, I just waited, holding on for dear life. Worry finally overtook me as the dire nature of my situation set in. I would win, but I would freeze to death in the process, as I didn't have the strength to pull myself out of the river. And even if I did get out, I'd die on my way home to exposure, wet to the bone as I was, and with the temperature outside well into the negatives. The air itself would do me in. I was starting to slip away into unconsciousness when I noticed the snowflakes begin to fall to the ground again. That was a clear signal that the game was over, so I started screaming, "Help! Please, help me!" My voice, although weak, carried far and wide through the night. I kept calling out, and soon enough I heard the creature barreling towards me through the forest. He emerged from between the trees, with a wide frown on his face that turned to a grin when he saw me. "You're quite resourceful, Nicholas," he said as he approached the river. "I must commend you for that. And for defeating me." He stepped on the ice, and I expected his huge body to break it easily. But it didn't. The ice didn't as much as crack under his enormous weight. One of his appendages came up, and he pointed it my way for me to grab it. I did, and he effortlessly lifted me out of the water. "Now, hold on tight. We have to get you to shelter right away," he said as he put me on his back. I got my arms around his throat, and he galloped through the forest with the same amazing speed he had displayed before. If not for the circumstances I was in, I might have enjoyed the bumpy, fast-paced ride. In no time at all, we were back home, and I went inside to change and warm up. "You'll get a nasty cold tomorrow, but you will live," he told me, "and your father will as well. You won, so I will see to my end of our agreement." He went to Dad's room with me in tow, and he placed his creepy feet along Dad's sleeping form. Color gradually returned to Dad's skin and he drew in a deep inhale. But he didn't wake up. "There, I have upheld my promise," he said and turned to leave the room. "See you next year, Nicholas, and remember to be a good boy." He then left through the chimney, and I heard him scurrying off back into the forest. True to his word, my father woke up the next morning in perfect health, to everyone's utter shock except my own. "I asked Santa to make you better as my gift," I explained to him and Daisy. I tried to tell them more, to go into detail, but I couldn't, and I don't mean that in a corny "oh I didn't want them to worry" way. I literally couldn't. The words wouldn't travel up my throat, no matter how hard I tried to push them out. My father nodded, and a few tears escaped his eyes. Tears of happiness, I thought at the time. But now I'm having doubts. That Christmas was the happiest one in my life, and getting to spend it with my father made me forget my ordeal. Later checkups with the doctors revealed that any trace of cancer was gone from his body. Like it was never even there. They questioned him, of course. But that got them nowhere. So they called it a miraculous recovery and left it at that. But my story doesn't end there. Unfortunately, for the creature kept its other promise as well, returning year after year on Christmas Eve for us to play again. Just as the first time, it allowed me to choose. And I chose every game under the sun over the years. I'd research and practice them the whole year beforehand. And I never picked games based on luck, just ones based on skill. That allowed me to remain one step ahead and win each and every time. Much to the creature's surprise, my father lived a long and healthy life. But he died in the summer of 2020 at 72. I myself am 43 years old, going on 44, and we maintained a close relationship throughout the years. His death was devastating to me, but I found solace in the fact that I delayed it all of those decades ago. But then something else happened, and on the Christmas Eve of 2020, I finally lost my first game with the creature. He grinned widely like he'd done back when he chased me, and I prepared myself to be dragged off to some horrible fate. Instead, he left without saying a word. I don't know if he'll return again this Christmas, but truth be told, I might not live to see the 24th. A couple of months ago, I fell ill just like my dad had. I made appointments and got checked out, and my worst fear was realized. I was diagnosed with the same cancer that the creature got rid of in my father. Ever since, I've spent my time in and out of chemotherapy as I slowly deteriorated. Even though money is no longer a problem and medical knowledge has advanced so far, I'm still beyond saving. I'm lying on my deathbed now as I write this out, counting the moments, unsure how many of them I have left. But I'm not scared for myself. No, you see, I have a loving wife by my side and 2 young kids of my own. 2 brothers of 7 and 9 years old respectively. 2 amazing yet naive kids that I love like nothing else in this world, and who are as pained to see me in this condition as I was to see my father. So yes, the creature might return this Christmas to play once more, but I worry that this time I won't be one of the players. I've tried talking to my wife and sons about it, but it's just like all of those years ago. The words about the creature won't come out of me. My only hope now is that I'll be 6 feet under come the 24th of December, so that my sins won't be passed down to my sons like they've been passed down to me by my father. I'd gladly take death over waking up healthy on Christmas morning. Story: I spent 23 years in prison, and my last 2 weeks were the most dangerous. That's not to say the previous years were easy. Far from it. There were long stretches of hopelessness and desperation, wishing to go back in time somehow, some way, change what I'd done, but wishing did nothing. And the only reality was my 8x11 cell and the moments I spent out of it. Quickly I learned that I had to stop thinking about the outside world, even when it entered my new one. The first time my wife and kids came to visit me, I had a black eye and broken nose from talking to the wrong person in the lunch line. After that, only my wife came to visit. She stuck with her weekly trips until I was transferred out of state to Pickaway County Pen to sure out my sentence. The visits became phone calls, which became letters, which became silence. It was just too difficult for all of us. I can't imagine what it was like for them to see a loved one in a place like that. It was so hard for me to see them come in. They seemed perfect and innocent. A shimmer of momentary light in my new dark world. And it was all so senseless. What I'd done hadn't even been intentional. It was an accident, a slip of the mind, a momentary break from my daily duties. But it resulted in 13 deaths. An entire family Christmas dinner party. 2 grandparents, 4 couples, and 7 grandchildren, all gone. And it was all because their landlord, me, hadn't made the appropriate changes to their furnace and it spewed out carbon monoxide as the family gathered. The new CO2 detectors hadn't been installed yet. All 13 were dead at the dinner table before the meal cooled. We were just getting home from our own family dinner when I saw the M's vehicles outside. I knew right away what happened, as did investigators. I was taken into custody soon after and a case was levied against me as new information came out about several arguments I'd had with the tenants. They pushed for intent, but it was weak and fell apart. But still, I was sentenced to 30 years through varying convictions regarding gross negligence resulting in the deaths of those 13 people. One of their relatives came to visit me once. She spat on the glass partition and told me she hoped I went to hell. The adjustment from real life to prison life was hard, but I found it built up my discipline. Every aspect of my life was regimented into sections of the day. And because of my condition, I was granted certain privileges and accesses I wouldn't normally have. My condition was a calcified brain tumor that I've had since I was a child. My mother had the same one. In fact, she developed it when she was pregnant with me. It was located in a place in the brain, the same as mine, where it couldn't be operated on. Because she was pregnant with me, most treatment options were out for my mom. The doctors gave her 3 months to live. At the time, I was 4 months from being born. So the whole thing turned into a grand supportive push from everyone around her to keep my mother alive long enough to give birth to me. Long enough that even if I was premature, I'd be developed enough to live a normal life. 3 months passed. My mom was still going. Then, I was born, a healthy baby boy, and all of a sudden, the brain tumor had calcified and was no longer an issue. The same as mine, only I didn't get mine in my 30s. Like my mother did, mine developed when I was 10. It came on fast. All of a sudden I was getting terrible migraines and my vision would go blurry. I hid it from my parents for as long as I could, because I knew the story of my birth and that it would be upsetting to my mother. What happened was worse. She found me bleeding from my ears in the backyard. I was rushed to the hospital and found to have the same tumor. Only mine was more advanced and aggressive. The doctors gave me a month. My parents were devastated. I was in shock. The next few weeks were filled with tests and arrangements. Most of it was a blur. But the afternoon I remember most was when my parents took me to the mall and told me I could go into any clothing store and pick out any suit or outfit I wanted. I knew something was up, because we were poor and this never happened in our family. And as I was trying on clothes, my parents were crying. It didn't dawn on me until years later that they took me there to pick out what I'd be buried in. But I never brought it up with them. I never needed to. The month passed, and then another one did, and another. My tumor had shrunk and calcified. It was still there, like my mother's, but was unreachable and from what the doctors said, was dead and not dangerous. It was a miracle, just like my mom's. Of course, I still had migraines from time to time, but it beats dying at 10 years old. And as I said, it helped separate me from typical prison life. Working in the library meant I got access to it at most times of the day. So that's where I went. I read a lot the first few years. I took classes and workshops. I even discovered a secret about the library. It had a hidden room. It wasn't really a room, so much as half a cell that had been closed off with a steel sheet behind a large bookshelf. The steel sheet had come loose and allowed entry, but could be slid back to make it invisible again. Of course, the half cell was enclosed by cement. There was no escaping through it, but it was a place you could hide, if you needed to, and I added some small makeshift locks to the inside, in case I ever needed it. The only person I ever told about the secret hideout was a small, defenseless man named Jackson who'd gotten a job in the library. He was doing a 15-year stint for wire and mail fraud amongst a few others and had already been eaten up a few times by the more unwelcoming inmates. Jackson and I became good friends. And even though my parole had been granted and I was gonna be out in a few months, I was gonna miss him and our chats. Jackson was also the first and only person I told about the new inmate. I'd watched the transport bus from the window of the library and saw the 2x2 group of 16 inmates marched out and entered into their new caged home. He was in the last group of 2. And the guy beside him looked terrified. The new prisoner was named Laveau. He was black with a thick, dark afro jutting out in short, strange dreads. Laveau was a Haitian immigrant with a harsh, severe and bony face. Whispers about him having ties to voodoo black magic circulated through the yard. And it was easy to see why. Wherever Laveau went in the prison, people kept their distance. It was almost like he emitted some strange unseen but heavily felt radiation that caused inmates to scatter as Laveau got closer. I watched it happen from the library window as Laveau would move through the yard. Slowly, and groups of people, whoever they were, would get up and casually scatter to other ends of the yard. In the CAF, the same thing happened at tables at meal times, and in the showers, too. Not that I ever had a run-in. About a week into Laveau's arrival, inmates in cells were switched around after an internal drug bust and Laveau's previously single room became a double. The man who moved into Laveau's cell was a gangbanger named Stax. Stax was a loud mouth and went off at anyone who would listen. But the morning after he moved into Laveau's cell, Stax was a different person. He was quiet, still, and he looked terrified. Stax walked into the CAF at breakfast and stopped in the middle of the line. He tipped his head down and stared at the ground in front of his feet. He didn't budge until breakfast was over. Then he left and went outside. In the yard, Stax did the same thing. He stared down, just ahead of his feet, until our time outside was almost up. But before it was, one of Stax's boys, Alamar, finally came up to him and tried to get his attention. Stax finally turned his eyes away from the ground and looked up. Matching Alamar's, Stax's eyes went wide. He looked terrified. Alamar backed away and the alarm buzzed for us to go inside. Stax's eyes were locked on Alamar now. I didn't see either of them until the next day, and they were both dead when I did. Stax had found a small partition of metal, bent it multiple times and sharpened an edge into a shiv. He'd stabbed Alamar to death with it, poked out his eyes, then slit his own throat. It was an open and shut case to anyone not watching. But I was watching, and I continued to track Laveau as he'd get closer and closer to people at lunch, in the yard and in the halls. 2 more inmates died, this time in the showers. The same details as Stax and Alamar: metal shiv, dozens of stab wounds, eyes poked out, and the suicidal throat slashed to cap it. Word was spreading through the yard that a huge inmate named Lil Mo put out a hit on Laveau. Lil Mo was the head of one of the black gangs and had resources. He also had ties to the kitchen, so his first thought was to poison Laveau. The problem was, no one ever saw Laveau eat, so Lil Mo had to come up with a new plan. Lil Mo increased the money reward he was offering, but no one was taking the job. 2 more inmates died, metal shiv, stab wounds, poked out eyes, slashed throat suicide, and both of the victims were members of Lil Mo's gang. The reward was doubled. A group of 3 thugs that basically controlled the bench press in the workout yard 24/7. Agreed to take on the job. Lil Mo got them actual weapons, knives and solid metal pipes. He didn't care if the murder didn't look like an accident. The longer Laveau was alive, the less Lil Mo controlled the yard. A manufactured fight between 2 of Lil Mo's men caused a distraction for the guards while the 3 thugs followed Laveau out of the lunchroom. They supposedly attacked Laveau in the hallway, but no one knows what happened. Only what happened next. When all the inmates were allowed outside that afternoon, the 3 thugs were standing in the middle of the yard, nowhere near the bench press station, and they were staring blankly at the ground. No one could get their attention. The 3 men only moved when the alarm buzzed for us to go back inside. And when we did, there was Laveau, waiting in the darkness of his cell, untouched. That night, there were screams through the cells. The prison went into a lockdown for 24 hours. By the time it was reopened, news had traveled to every inmate about what had happened. The 3 thugs had gone into their cells that night, killed their bunkmates with shivs, and then killed themselves. 6 deaths in one night. It was a prison record. None of the inmates knew what to do. I was lucky and got to spend most of my time away from them in the library. But I watched from the windows as they all tried to avoid Laveau. And for the most part, they did. Word got out that Laveau was being transferred to another prison. Not a tear was shed from anyone. But it wasn't happening until the end of the month, which was 3 weeks away. And in the second, Laveau caught me watching him. I was in the library as usual, standing by the window and watching the events of the exercise yard. I was trying to find Laveau, but couldn't spot him. Then I did. Laveau was standing near the basketball court. His eyes were fixed on me in the window. I actually felt colder when I saw him. I was so fixed on his eyes I didn't realize Laveau had started walking to the entrance doors to the prison. He disappeared inside and I lost sight of him. For some reason, I knew he was on his way up to me. I turned to move to the exit, and came face to face with Laveau. A moment later, he was beside me. Laveau was whispering into my ear and my vision suddenly darkened. I knew I was losing consciousness and my legs were buckling. I fell back against the carpeted floor of the library, and my head hit something familiar. It was the pillow on my bunk. My vision flooded back and I was no longer in the library. I was laying in my bed back in my cell. But it was night now. The prison was freezing. I could see my own breath. My jail door was open. So I got up and looked out to the small courtyard and opposing wall of cells facing mine. There was a strange light coming from somewhere below us that pulsed a dark red, filling the compound for a moment, before it plunged us back into darkness. What I could see was that the other cells were all closed, and they appeared to be empty. A loud screech came from the bottom left corner of the wall of cells facing mine. I knew right away whose cell it was coming from. My eyes instinctively moved to the sound. It was Laveau's cell, and it was open. I knew Laveau was standing in his cell, just out of sight. Then his footsteps carried his strange and wiry frame in the pulsing red light. He was staring up at me. His eyes locked onto mine again. A new series of screeches pierced out from all over the prison. All the cell doors were now sliding open. In the depths of the dark cells, I could see the same figures waiting to step out. Dozens of twin Laveaus stepped out of the open cell doors from everywhere. The ones facing me and the ones on my side. And every single Laveau was staring directly at me. They all had white paint in smeared streaks vertically down their faces like some war mask. In an instant, they all moved at the exact same time. Darting towards me, I jumped back into my cell, grabbing a hold of the door, expecting it not to budge. But it did. It slid shut and I held it there. Arms reached in, grabbing me and squeezing my throat. Dozens of bodies were piled up against the bars of my cell, trying to pull the door open or tear me apart. Somehow, the door held, and they didn't get in. But Laveau floated through the bars and into my cell. He hovered over me, the skin on his face melting away and dripping down onto mine. Large flashes of white light filled my cell in quick, repeated strobes. Then I was in one of the prison hospital rooms. I was in a bed with tubes and monitors attached to me. A nurse told me I'd been found in the library. I'd fallen and cracked my head, suffering a heavy concussion. I'd been out for 2 days. I asked about Laveau, but they said it had just been me in the library. No sign of anyone else. Somehow, whatever Laveau did to the other prisoners didn't work on me. The only thing I could think of was the calcified tumor in my brain. Could it possibly have saved my life? Suddenly, I was feeling grateful for what was previously a curse. I was released back to Gen Pop 2 days later, and immediately wished I was still in the infirmary. Things had gotten scary. Laveau's transfer was coming up, and it looked like he had been busy while I was out. My first day back, I was late going out to the yard in the morning. I wished I hadn't gone at all. More than half of the inmates outside were in the statue stance. Unmoving, unwavering. They were unresponsive to the guards, even when the guards took it a step further and pepper sprayed, tasered and billy clubbed them. The inmates didn't move. They all stood their grounds. Only now, they weren't looking down. They were looking at me. And Laveau was amongst them. The alarm buzzed for the end of the outside break. Every inmate staring at me bolted for me in sync. There were frightening snarls on their faces and they looked overcome with rage like they wanted to tear me apart. I wasn't far from the doors and got inside just as the riot team was on its way out. They'd seen the large group of inmates doing the statue pose in the yard, and the team was on the ready to make a move. I burst through the line of riot shields as they didn't seem to care about me. I ran as fast as I could, knowing there was only one place I might be safe. I heard the doors behind me burst open, followed by screams and yells from the crowd of possessed inmates. I knew the riot team would only hold for so long. I just needed to get to the library. I made my way down the few hallways it took to get there and found it empty. I jammed a chair against the door handle and ran to the back of the library. When I got to the back wall, I shifted the bookshelf forward at the far end and slid behind it into the opening. I pulled the metal sheet aside and slid in. I pulled the metal sheet back and fastened it to 3 makeshift locks I'd built over the years. Outside, I heard the library door burst open and the yells of insane inmates screaming for my blood filled the room. I built the locks, so knew they were pretty strong. But were they strong enough to keep out the hordes of inmates pouring into the library? I knew they were going to find the cubby, because I saw Jackson in the horde of inmates chasing me. He knew this was here, and whatever he knew, I imagined Laveau knew. Sure enough, I heard the bookshelf in front of my hiding place crash down. Hands pounded against the metal sheet. The locks I made rattled in their hinges. My voice was called out, shrilly, from a strangely disturbed-sounding Jackson. The mob kept banging on the metal sheet, trying to break through or shift it enough to get inside. But it stuck, and they didn't get in. I'm not sure how much time passed, but eventually, the banging stopped and so did the screaming. I stayed in the cubby overnight, just in case. The next morning, I heard cleanup crews clearing rooms. I unlocked the latches and slid the metal sheet aside. The room was filled with the bodies of inmates. Orange jumpsuits stained red, stab wounds and throat slits. Eyes punctured and hollowed out. The cleaning crew entered and stared at me like I was levitating. They hadn't expected to find any survivors. But there I stood, not a drop of blood or a scratch on me. I was led back to my cell where I waited to be told where to go or what to do. My sentence was basically done and the authorities gave the green light to release me a few days early. In the days after the release, I looked into what happened at the prison. Apparently, over 200 inmates and 14 prison guards died in the riot. But the whole thing was being hushed over and claimed to be some kind of mass food poisoning. The names of the dead inmates were made public. Laveau wasn't one of them. I looked into him and even hired a private investigator to find out if and where Laveau had ended up. Turned out, he'd been transferred out of state, and by the time I'd gotten the information, there'd already been 2 deaths and 2 suicides at Laveau's new prison. Story. It all started with a hot air balloon. It appeared on the horizon early one morning, at the very far edge of Caleb's field. It was just a blip at first, but as it gently wafted closer to my property, it became large enough to blot out the sun. My son Henry was captivated. He'd never seen a hot air balloon in person before. He watched it drift closer and closer, then ran out on the porch in his dinosaur onesie, and watched it creeping even closer. As I drank my coffee, I could hear the sputters of the fire keeping the colorful thing afloat. It would stop and start periodically, bursting to life in a geyser of flames. My son waved excitedly, but his excitement waned as the hot air balloon drew nearer. "Mommy, there's no one in the basket," he said. I heard the burner puttering. What do you mean, honey? I asked through the open window. I stretched down and peered up at the object in the sky. Henry was right. There was no one manning the hot air balloon. Weird, I thought. Must have gotten loose. There hadn't been much wind that morning. But if whoever the balloon belonged to hadn't tied it down properly, it could have drifted off on its own. Out of curiosity, I grabbed my keys, buckled my son in the backseat of the truck, and took off after it. The balloon ran out of fuel and landed on the outskirts of my field. Where I finally caught up to it, Caleb was already there, sitting on his four-wheeler and scrutinizing it with a perplexed expression on his face. "Morning, Grace," he said, never looking away from the object as the envelope slowly lost its circular shape and fanned to the ground like curtains in the breeze. "Howdy, Caleb. Any idea what this straggler's doing here?" I asked. I opened the back door to let Henry out. My excitable son jumped out of the truck and bolted towards the hot air balloon. Thankfully, Caleb grabbed him by the shoulders and held him back. "No, son, it's not safe. Might catch fire. Best to keep your distance," he told Henry. His gaze then fell on me. Not sure. I reckon it's a runaway tourist attraction from a few towns over," I theorized. He rubbed his bushy chin. Yeah, that's probably it." Henry squirmed in Caleb's firm grip. "Mum, I wanna go look." The last of the fabric fell and draped over a patch of soil. "Should be safe now," said Caleb, jerking his head towards my son. I nodded back, and he let Henry go. My boy squealed and ran towards the basket. "Careful not to touch the burner. Honey, it's still hot," I called out, hands on my hips. Caleb followed him at a much slower pace. "It's quiet this morning," he murmured. "Did you notice?" I shook my head. "It's never quiet with Henry around." He laughed. I picked up the pace as Henry pulled himself aboard. Though I knew it was impossible, a small part of me was afraid the balloon would inflate and my son would fly off into the sky, never to be seen or heard from again. Just one of the many ridiculous automatic thoughts you get when you're a parent. Everything has the potential to be dangerous, even when it's not. Thankfully, the hot air balloon stayed right where it was, and Henry ran around in the basket like it was the best toy he'd ever seen. "Now don't you break anything, Henry," I said, leaning over the side of the basket. Caleb knelt down, lifted the fabric, and inspected it curiously. "Everything looks intact. Best not leave it out here, though. Help me put it in the back of my truck. I'll store it in the barn until its owners show up," I answered. It probably cost a pretty penny. Someone was bound to come claim it sooner or later. Maybe I'd convince them to take us up for a ride as a thank you. I shooed Henry out of the basket and told him to go sit in the truck while Caleb and I unhooked the fabric, rolled it, and tossed it in the back. We then grabbed the basket and hoisted it up. "Shit," I whispered, straining to lift it. "Heavier than it looks." Beads of sweat were rolling down Caleb's face. "Probably because of the burner." I nodded. It wasn't easy, but we managed to force it in the truck. Caleb helped me tie it down while Henry watched eagerly from the back seat. "Phew," I mumbled, wiping my brow. I was definitely having second thoughts about bringing it into the barn. Maybe I'd just throw a tarp on it once I got home and call it a day. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. "I best be headed back. The wife'll want to know what all the excitement was about. He hopped on his four-wheeler and gave me a wave. Thanks, Caleb. Y'all take care, I answered. We both took off in opposite directions. Henry watched as Caleb disappeared on the horizon, and then stared at our rows of corn the rest of the way home. As we pulled into the driveway, Henry said, "Mr. Scarecrow's doing a good job today." "What?" He pointed to the field. "Look." I followed his gaze to the scarecrow. For the first time in years, there were no crows cawing around it, or anywhere else on the property. Stupid thing never worked before. Don't know why it was working now. Well, I'll be damned. Caleb was right. Without the incessant bird calls, and with most of the animals still asleep, it was rather quiet out. So quiet, in fact, that I could hear a low atmospheric hum droning on in the background. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else goes away. It was neither peaceful nor annoying, it was just a constant low sound easily drowned out by my son's babbling. Spencer, our farmhand, arrived late that morning. I was already washing the dishes from breakfast when I saw him driving up the road. He had a bad habit of being tardy, so I wasn't exactly surprised when he came running through the door. Huffing, puffing, and apologizing. "Sorry, ma'am. This is the last time. I swear," he said. I stared at him, unimpressed. "Do you hear what happened?" he asked. "The hot air balloon? Yeah, I was there, and I still managed to make it back here on time to feed the livestock." He lowered his head in shame. "Sorry, ma'am." I sighed. "It's fine. Just get to work, all right?" He nodded, just as he was about to step out the door. However, we heard a booming noise off in the distance. "What in tarnation was that?" he asked, peering out towards the field. "Transformer exploded?" I suggested. "Too loud for that," he replied. We stepped onto the porch and scanned the area, until we spotted a wisp of smoke in the distance. "Looks like it's coming from the Burns field," he said. "Probably just their tractor. Mr. Burns has been meaning to replace that old thing for years now." "Guess the engine finally gave out," I replied, and then shoved him lightly. "Come on. Enough procrastinating. You've got work to do." His eyes stayed locked on the small column of smoke for a moment, but he eventually nodded. "All right. Sorry, ma'am." While Spencer was doing hard labor outside and Henry was watching cartoons in the other room, I got to work pickling vegetables for storage. It was nearing lunch when Spencer finally showed up again. He was covered in dirt. Took care of the cattle and everything. "Ma'am," he said. "Good work, Spence. I'll have lunch ready in a minute. You mind doing one last thing? There's a tarp in the barn. Be a dear and go get it for me?" "Sure, ma'am." "Where exactly?" "In the storage loft. Can't miss it. I'll be back in a minute," he answered. I watched him walking into the barn while I tended to the hash browns. Then, I waited for a couple of minutes. Then 5, then 10. What the hell is taking so long? I paced back and forth, irritated. His car was still in the driveway, so I knew he hadn't slipped away to go flirt with some girl in town. With a grunt, I stomped into the barn, expecting to see him lounging about. I was prepared to chastise him for his laziness. "Spence?" I asked angrily as the door swung open. A ladder was propped against the wooden loft, the tarp at its feet. I grabbed the tarp and peered up, trying to find Spencer. "Spence, what are you playing at?" I called. No answer. "Spence, lunch is ready. Get down from there," I insisted. Still nothing. Not even a single creak from the wooden planks. All I could hear was the quiet hum from earlier. This time, slightly louder. If Spencer was up there, he was being perfectly still and quiet. Two things he wasn't too good at. Tarp wedged under my arm. I grabbed the ladder and began climbing the rungs. I was about halfway up when I heard Henry calling. "Mom, I'm hungry." Well, I had what I needed. I had the tarp. Spencer could play his stupid games all he wanted. For all I cared, I slid back down and went back inside to serve lunch. "Where's Spencer?" asked Henry. "He's trying a brand new diet of cold eggs and ham," I answered. Ew. We finished eating with no sign of Spencer. I was starting to get a little worried. He wasn't the most reliable guy. He'd often come in late and cut out early. But he'd never run off on me in the middle of the day. And he'd certainly never leave his car behind. I figured I'd go look for him once I was done with the dishes. Henry was playing with his toys and I was drying off the last of the pots and pans. I probably never would have noticed it if the sun wasn't shining at just the right angle, sending a beam of light from floor to ceiling. Dust particles. They were dancing through the room's air currents. However, about a foot below the ceiling, there was a visible decrease in the density. I watched as little flakes swam up and disappeared beyond the invisible border. Weird, I thought, squinting at the empty space. There was something about it that made me feel unnerved. It's like I knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite put my finger on what. I looked outside. Not a bird in sight for miles. I thought of the hot air balloon and how empty it had been. I thought about Spencer up in the barn's loft. A bumblebee buzzed by the window, flew up beyond the intangible line, and disappeared. 1 second it was there. The next, it was just gone. "I'm going to get my trucks," squeaked Henry as he ran towards the stairs. I grabbed him so quickly that he nearly fell. "Don't go upstairs," I warned, my voice a mix of stern conviction and crackling terror. I gulped down a knot of apprehension. My eyes were locked on the immaculate separation between the dusty and nearly dustless air. In that moment, I could only think of one thing. Something I'd heard on TV. Dust is mainly comprised of dead skin cells. My blood ran cold. I could see it moving. The separation. I mean, slowly, like the motion of the sun setting on the horizon. It was subtle, but it was definitely moving down. That's when I realized that humming sound from this morning was getting even louder. We need to get to lower ground, I thought. I wasn't even sure what was going on, but I knew that something bad would happen if we were caught under the unseen ceiling slowly dropping on us. We lived on a plateau surrounded by mountains, the lowest point for miles. There was no lower ground, except for the cellar. Ducking my head, I grabbed Henry's arm and pulled him towards the door. "Mum, what are you doing?" he whined, tugging back. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I closed the door tightly, unsure whether or not it would help keep it whatever it was out. The mere possibility that it might help was enough to bring me some form of comfort. With my free hand, I nabbed the flashlight I kept on the top step and climbed down with my son. It was cold downstairs, perfect for storage, I had shelves with jars full of pickled vegetables, homemade jams, and sealed meats lining every wall. The concrete room wasn't very inviting to a 7-year-old, so Henry usually stayed out unless I asked him to fetch me something. I let out a sigh of relief and took a seat on the bottom of the wooden staircase. I could hear frogs and crickets chirping happily outside. "Mom?" I didn't answer. Instead, I went over the facts in my mind. Was I exaggerating? What had compelled me to run and hide? An empty hot air balloon? A missing farmhand? "Mom." "Huh? What? Henry?" I replied. He bounced around from foot to foot. "What's going on?" I paused, thinking it over. What was I supposed to tell the kid? I didn't even know what was happening. My eyebrows came together. "There's bad air up there." "Like a fart?" I sighed. "Yeah, something like that." I hung my head and hid my face behind my hands. I was being stupid, at least. That's what I thought, until the croaks came to a sudden stop, as though all the bullfrogs in the creek out back were suddenly holding their breaths. I found myself holding mine, waiting for the sound to come back. But all I heard were the crickets. 10 minutes later, the crickets went silent. The void from the hush that fell over the room couldn't even be filled by the pitter-patter of Henry's feet as he ran in circles. Bored out of his mind, my fear only increased as I spotted the jars of meat sitting on the top shelf of the rack in the corner. They were empty. I pointed the flashlight up and looked at the dust particles in its ray. They were disappearing about 2 feet from the ceiling, just like they had upstairs. And, just like upstairs, the invisible divide was getting lower. That low hum following suit. All I could do was watch as, over the course of an hour, the separation came closer and closer to my son and I until it became clear that I couldn't sit on the stairs anymore. I pulled Henry into my lap and sat on the cold concrete floor, shaking as I watched the invisible ceiling falling on us. From time to time, I had to jiggle the flashlight to get it working again. I rocked my son gently, praying whatever was falling on us would stop and pull back, praying Henry wouldn't go rogue on me and run out of my grasp. As it came closer, I laid down and told my son to do the same. We had to stay as low to the ground as possible. "Don't move, honey," I told him. "Mom, what are you doing?" "We're playing dead, honey. If you do good, I'll bake you your favorite cake," I promised. "But you gotta be perfectly still." "All right, okay," he said. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would it hurt when it happened? Would we disappear like the people in the hot air balloon? Could we somehow be saved? I held my hand against Henry's chest, pinning him down like a seatbelt. I could feel him shivering against the cold stone floor. I was terrified he'd squirm and disappear forever. Should have brought a blanket, I thought. No, the blankets were on the second floor. The second floor hadn't been safe. There was a rock digging into my thigh, but I couldn't risk moving. The threshold was closing in on us, making me feel claustrophobic in the wide open room. I dropped the flashlight, closed my eyes tightly, and held my breath for as long as I could. I waited, listening to the droning hum getting louder and louder like a bug circling my ear. I could feel Henry's body heat radiating from his chest. As long as I felt that warmth on my arm, I knew my boy was okay. Even if I disappeared, at least he'd be lower to the ground, low enough to be safe. I hoped. We must have been there for at least an hour, maybe 2. Before the sound became more distant, Henry had somehow fallen asleep despite the displeasing conditions. I opened my eyes, finally gathering enough courage to reach for the flashlight. I flicked it on and carefully aimed it at the ceiling. The dust wasn't back, but I couldn't see a divide anymore. Either we'd been engulfed, or the phenomena had passed. I was afraid to move at first, but I finally raised my arm. Nothing happened. I sat up. Still nothing. I let out a sigh of relief. We'd been spared. Somehow. By some miracle. We'd been spared. When the hum completely faded, I cautiously climbed up the stairs. Keeping my head low, I opened the door and looked around. The sound was gone. The invisible divide. Gone with it. It was over. After waking Henry and warming him up, I headed out to the barn. It was empty. No birds. No livestock. Not even a single fly buzzing around the cow manure. Every single animal on my farm had gone missing. We got in the truck and headed towards town. As we passed the Burns farm, I saw their crop duster crashed to pieces in the field. Must have been the explosion Spencer and I heard earlier. I stopped to check, but the plane was empty. I knocked on the Burns door, but received no answer. I drove to Caleb's farm and tried them. No answer. I drove to town. There was no one. Not a single living being. Not even a goddamn squirrel. I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm afraid it's about to happen again. I can hear that hum in the distance. As much as I want to get out of here, I can't take the risk. I mean, the only path out of here is through the mountains, and I don't fancy going anywhere too high right now. I'm going to try my luck and hide in the cellar again. If you don't hear from me, it means we weren't lucky enough to be spared twice. Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.